The weight of gold. The early years of Mansa Musa, a prince in the shadow. You are standing on the edge of the Sahel in the late 13th century. To your north lie the dunes and dryness of the Sahara. To the south, the forested lands that feed rivers with stories. In between is a band of grassland and scattered settlements, where survival is measured not by dramatic battles or towering conquests, but by the ability to persist through sun, sand, and silence. This is where Musa Keita, later known as Mansa, Musa, began his life, not in glory but in governance, inheritance, and the understated gears of empire. Musa was not born a ruler. He was born a prince in a growing empire, the Mali Empire, that itself was built upon the remnants of Ghana, another forgotten powerhouse of trans-Saharan trade. By the time of Musa's birth, likely in the 1280s, Mali had already begun its transformation from a regional power into a continental force. Yet this transformation was not made in swift, spectacular strokes. It was carved in slow negotiations, grain distributions, and long camel treks. The Keita dynasty, to which Musa belonged, traced its origins to the legendary Sundiata Keita, the so-called Lion King of Mali, whose legacy had become more myth than memory. Sundiata's victory at the Battle of Karina in 1235 gave rise to the empire, but by the time Musa was born, the empire's day-to-day survival was handled less through warfare and more through administrative patience. As a child, Musa would have been surrounded by ledgers, not swords. He was likely educated in Arabic, not for spiritual reasons alone, but because Arabic was the language of trade, diplomacy, and administration. Mali's elite, though culturally rooted in local traditions, had to communicate with Muslim merchants from North Africa. Knowledge of Arabic meant not only access to the Quran, but to commercial contracts and tax records. The education of a prince in Mali was less about conquest and more about endurance. Musa would have learned how to measure rainfall in distant provinces, how to estimate salt yields from mines in Gaza, and how to distribute grain from central stores during times of drought. The empire's wealth, after all, came not just from gold, but from its ability to feed its people through seasons of unpredictability. This was boring work, deeply, painfully boring, yet it was also vital. In these early years, Musa's role would have been largely observational. As a younger royal, he was not immediately in line for succession. Instead, he likely traveled between provincial centers, witnessed court deliberations, and listened to advisors debate the merits of camel versus donkey transport. Such knowledge, though tedious, built a foundation of statecraft. One particular area of importance was the Bure goldfields. While Mali is often remembered as a land dripping in gold, the truth is more mundane. The gold did not glitter openly on the streets. It had to be mined with effort, traded carefully, and weighed meticulously. Musa likely visited these mines during his youth, escorted by guards and scribes. The work of miners, often slaves or bonded laborers, was slow and backbreaking. Dust clung to their skin, and tunnels collapsed more often than outsiders imagined. And yet, from this monotony came the wealth that would fund an empire's grand gestures. Meanwhile, the capital of Niani was a modest administrative hub. Unlike the exaggerated palaces of later European imagination, Niani was composed of earthen structures, open courtyards, and quiet bureaus. It was here that Musa may have learned the slow rhythm of governance. Taxes collected not in haste, but over months, Decisions not made in a day but argued through councils. Perhaps the most formative influence on Musa was not a general or scholar, but a scribe. In a court where oral tradition remained important, the rise of written record-keeping was reshaping power. Scribes, many trained in Islamic law and jurisprudence, maintained ledgers and translated diplomatic letters. They were keepers of memory, official memory, dry and deliberate. Musa's respect for their work would later lead to his patronage of scholars, but in these early years, it simply meant listening to debates over grammar and protocol. Then, sometime in his adult life, everything changed with a journey, though not one of his choosing. The reigning Mansa, Abu Bakr II, is believed to have embarked on an expedition across the Atlantic Ocean, possibly in pursuit of lands beyond the sea. He entrusted the throne to Musa as his deputy, or deputy Mansa. The exact mechanics of this transfer remain murky, and historians debate the motives and methods, but the outcome is clear. Abu Bakr did not return, and Musa, the quiet observer, became the sovereign ruler of Mali. This moment, abrupt and poorly documented, marks the shift from a background figure to a central one, yet it raises more questions than it answers. How did Musa react to this sudden responsibility? Was he prepared for leadership? Or did he struggle to find his footing in the early years? And what did it mean to hold such immense wealth and responsibility in a land where record-keeping was imperfect and power was both inherited and earned? Becoming Mansa, the quiet rise of a golden king. You are now in the capital of Niani. The season is hot and dry, and the Sahel wind carries fine dust through the streets. The news is spreading slowly, whispered in markets and repeated in hushed tones among the palace servants. Mansa Abu Bakr II has not returned. His fleet sent west across the Atlantic was last seen vanishing into the horizon. Whether it was swallowed by the sea or turned back by winds, no one knows. And in the silence of his absence, Musa becomes Mansa. There is no coronation with golden crowns or velvet robes. Instead, the assumption of power comes through a sequence of protocols, meetings with senior advisors, public affirmations from local chiefs, quiet approval from scribes and religious leaders. Musa, though young and unproven, takes his seat with the understanding that he will guide an empire of farmers, traders, miners, and clerks. It's here at this moment that the story of the world's richest man begins in earnest, but not with opulence. Instead, it begins with paperwork. Mansa Musa inherits not only wealth, but also an administrative system layered with complexity. The Mali Empire at this time stretches across much of West Africa, from the Atlantic coast to the banks of the Niger River and from forested borders to the Saharan edge. With such expanse comes challenge. Dozens of languages, hundreds of minor leaders, and trade routes that must be guarded, taxed, and kept open through negotiation and force. Rather than consolidating power through war, Musa focuses on reinforcing stability. His early years as ruler are marked by effort, not extravagance. One of his first quiet reforms is in taxation. The empire's wealth depends on predictable tribute from its provinces. Grain, livestock, cloth, and gold flow toward the Kiu center, and Musa ensures that tribute is neither so heavy it sparks rebellion nor so light it threatens the capital's food stores. It's a delicate balance and one that requires patience, not charisma. Another of Musa's focuses is education, especially Islamic scholarship. Though Mali is not a fully Islamic state, the religion has taken deep root in the elite class, especially among merchants and administrators. Musa uses this as both a political tool and a personal value. He invites Muslim scholars and jurists from North Africa to his court, not to impress foreign visitors, but to train a new generation of administrators who can read, write, and govern with consistency. This choice may seem obvious now, but at the time, it was a strategic gamble. Embracing Islamic education tied Mali more closely to the cultural and intellectual centers of the broader Muslim world: Cairo, Tunis, Fez, and beyond. It also created a class of bureaucrats whose authority derived not from tribal lineage, but from literacy and law. That shift would slowly and quietly redefine power in the region. But Musa's empire is not governed solely by scribes. At the village level, life remains largely unchanged. Most people are farmers, waking before dawn to work small plots of millet or sorghum. Women manage households and trade in markets. Children fetch water from wells, and old men sit beneath baobab trees telling stories of Sundiata. These details, the truly boring parts of empire, form the backbone of Musa's domain. Despite the peace, the empire is not without threat. To the north, the Berber states watch Mali's rise with a mixture of admiration and rivalry. To the south, smaller kingdoms resist taxation, and within the empire itself, regional governors, called farbas, must be watched closely. Some are loyal, others ambitious. Musa keeps them in check not through violence, but through the slow work of bureaucratic oversight and redistribution of gifts and appointments. He also begins a long-term effort to codify laws. Though Mali is still governed in part by oral custom, Musa encourages the formalization of legal norms. Islamic Sharia is introduced in matters of trade and family law, particularly in urban areas. In rural zones, traditional justice remains dominant. This dual system is not always efficient, but it prevents revolt. People keep their customs while the empire gains consistency. And always, there is the gold. The mines of Bambuk and Bure continue to produce dust and nuggets. The gold is carefully weighed, taxed, and traded. It flows north toward Tagaza, where it is exchanged for salt, another substance of slow survival. From there, it moves through the Sahara via long camel caravans. In these early years, Musa does not expand the mines or dramatically increase production. Instead, he builds storage and trust. His goal is not wealth alone, but sustainable control of the economy. Interestingly, there are few great monuments from this early period of Musa's reign. He does not build grand mosques yet, nor does he commission the architectural wonders for which he will later be known. Instead, he focuses on people, advisors, scribes, teachers, traders, infrastructures built around them, grain depots, caravan rest stops, and irrigation improvements. He also expands diplomatic ties, quietly without pomp. Musa sends gifts to rulers across North Africa and receives travelers in return. Among them are scholars, merchants, and religious emissaries. Some return to their homes with tales of a calm but powerful ruler who governs through delegation and foresight. To maintain the appearance of continuity, Musa also embraces symbolism. He traces his legitimacy to Sundiata, using oral histories and court poets to reinforce the connection. Griots, The traditional storytellers are encouraged to tell of his lineage and virtue. Through them, his image is preserved, not in marble or painting, but in verse and voice. Years pass, and Musa becomes not just a ruler, but a stabilizing force. Crops are steady, roads are secure, trade is booming. Yet outside of Mali, his name remains largely unknown until one day he begins planning a journey that will quite suddenly make him famous far beyond the Sahel. He will go to Mecca, not in secret or humility, but in grandeur, though that grandeur is still only a plan in the back rooms of Niani. Why does he go? Is it faith? Is it diplomacy? Or does he sense that the time has come to show the world what Mali has become? Pilgrimage and projection. Mansa Musa's Golden Hajj. The year is 1324, and for the first time in the empire's history, the wealth of Mali is about to be displayed to the world, not in war or conquest, but in movement. The capital of Niani is bustling with preparation. Livestock is being herded. Bags of salt, fabric, grain, and gold are being loaded onto wagons and beasts of burden. Craftsmen work around the clock, fitting fine leather for saddles and harnesses. Even scribes are packing ink and parchment for the long journey ahead. Mansa Musa, now years into his reign, is preparing for the Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca, and it is not a modest journey. Pilgrimage to Mecca is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, a sacred duty for every Muslim who is able. But for a West African emperor, separated from the Arabian Peninsula by thousands of miles of desert and uncertainty, the undertaking is enormous. It is both a spiritual journey and a logistical feat of extraordinary proportions. Musa is not going alone. His entourage will eventually number some 60,000 people, though this figure, like much about Musa, is debated. What is known with certainty is that it includes soldiers, officials, merchants, griots, slaves, and servants. Among them are 500 personal attendants bearing staffs of gold, and a reported 100 camels, each carrying hundreds of pounds of the precious metal. There are cooks, water carriers, translators, and guides. Whole herds of livestock are brought along to feed the caravan. In the modern imagination, this journey has become a story of spectacle. Gold distributed so lavishly that entire regional economies were disrupted. But the truth again is slower, quieter, and perhaps even more staggering in its boring reality. Each day of the journey is a study in endurance. The caravan moves slowly through the empire, first crossing the well-maintained trails leading to the city of Walata. There, in the shadow of the desert's edge, final preparations are made for the real challenge, the crossing of the Sahara. This stretch takes weeks, possibly months. The Sahara is not simply a sea of sand. It is a zone of searing heat, bitter, cold at night, and long stretches without water. The caravan must follow established routes, stopping at known oases, coordinating with Tuareg and Berber guides, whose knowledge of these sands is passed down through generations. This is where Musa's administrative skill is on display. Every stop is planned, every ration calculated. He brings not just gold but grain and cloth, barter items for use in emergency trade. The survival of the Hajj caravan depends not on Musa's charisma but on ledgers and logistics. As the caravan enters North Africa, the landscape changes. Towns become denser. Arabic is spoken more fluently. Islamic schools, known as madrasas, become common. In these places, Musa begins to attract attention, not just for his wealth, but for his discipline. He prays at mosques, donates to scholars, and listens carefully to local jurists. He's not here to impress, he's here to connect. But the spectacle grows. In Cairo, his visit becomes legend. According to later accounts by the Egyptian historian Al-Makrizi, Musa's arrival in Cairo disrupts the local economy. Gold is handed out so freely that its value drops, causing inflation that lasts for years. While the precise economic effects are debated, there is no question that Musa's gifts are grand. He donates to the poor, to scholars, to rulers. He leaves behind a memory that spreads quickly across the Islamic world. This display is not just generosity, it is strategy. Musa understands the power of perception. The gold is not meant to flaunt, but to establish Mali as a serious Muslim power. In a world where cultural capital flows through Cairo, Mecca, and Baghdad, Musa wants Mali on the map. And it works. Maps produced in Europe decades later depict a black African king seated on a throne, holding a nugget of gold, labeled Mansa Musa, Lord of the Negroes of Guinea. In the Catalan Atlas of 1375, he is the richest, most recognizable figure in West Africa. But what matters most about Musa's Hajj is not what he gives away, it's what he brings back. Among the scholars who return with him is Al-Sahili, a Spanish Muslim poet and architect. Though much about his role is mythologized, Al-Sahili likely contributes to the design of major buildings in Mali, including mosques and schools. His presence marks a new chapter, the fusion of Islamic architectural style with West African materials and forms. Upon returning to Mali, Musa invests heavily in education and infrastructure. In Timbuktu, he expands the Sankore University and commissions mosques made of sun-dried brick and wood. These are not palaces for kings, but spaces for learning, designed to last generations. Timbuktu becomes a beacon of knowledge, attracting students from across West Africa. The city, once a trading post, evolves into a center of Islamic scholarship. Musa's quiet focus on literacy, law, and letters now bears fruit, and still the empire functions with the same slow, deliberate rhythm. Grain is harvested, caravans move, taxes are collected, the bureaucracy holds. Yet the Hajj changes something profound. Musa's empire is no longer just wealthy, it is respected. He has positioned Mali not merely as a source of gold, but as a participant in the intellectual and spiritual life of the broader Muslim world. Years pass. Musa continues to govern, though the exact date of his death remains uncertain, likely sometime between 1332 and 1337. His successor, Magan Musa, inherits a stable but increasingly complex empire. In the decades that follow, Mali's influence wanes, external threats increase, internal divisions grow. The gold still flows, but the bureaucracy begins to crack. By the 15th century, the Songhai Empire will rise to replace Mali as the dominant force in West Africa. And yet, Mansa Musa's legacy endures, not in grand battles or epic tales, but in the survival of texts, traditions, and testimony. His story is often reduced to a single headline: the richest man who ever lived. But behind that wealth was a man who governed through routine, who built through patience, and who understood that sometimes the most powerful acts in history come not from glory, but from the slow, boring work of building a world he left behind. No crown jewels, no sprawling armies, no romantic sagas. Only books, ledgers, and quiet golden footprints in the Sahel. Salt, sand, and strategy. The Saharan trade routes. The silent caravans of the desert. The desert doesn't scream. It hums, it moves with the wind, creaking across centuries of stillness. You are in the Sahara, not a single place, but a region that stretches across an entire continent like a pale sea. There are no signposts here, just sand, heat, and the relentless insistence of the sun. Yet for over 1,000 years, this harsh landscape was not a barrier, but a bridge. It connected the Mediterranean to the Sahel, linked cities like Cairo and Marrakesh with kingdoms like Mali and Kanem-Bornu. And through it moved not armies or tourists, but salt and silence. Welcome to the story of the Saharan trade routes. A history not of kings or battles, but of merchants, camels, and the long, slow rhythm of economic survival. The geography of trade begin by picturing the Sahara, 3.5 million square miles of sand and stone. It's not all dunes. Much of it is rock, gravel, and hardened earth. Water is scarce, and heat defines everything. Yet scattered across the desert are oases, life-sustaining pockets of date palms and wells. These become the dots on the map. Trade routes aren't straight lines, they are arcs, bending from water source to water source, known by memory more than by map. One of the oldest and most important of these routes begins near Sijil Masa, in what is now southeastern Morocco. From there, caravans head south, sometimes for weeks, toward cities like Ouagadougou, Gao, and later, Timbuktu. Another key route stretches from Ghadames in Libya down to the Kanem-Bornu Empire near Lake Chad. There are others too, east-west, connectors that helped build an entire network of desert commerce. The distances are measured not in miles but in days. 10 days to the next well, 3 to the next date grove, 40 days across the open sand. The men who lead these journeys are not kings or generals. They are guides, Berbers and Tuareg tribesmen who inherit the roots from their ancestors. Their knowledge is not written down. It's sung, told, remembered. The camel, ship of the desert. There is a single hero in this history. It is the camel. Before the camel, desert trade was minimal. Oxen and horses could not endure the heat. Humans could not carry enough water. But by the 3rd century CE, camels, introduced from the Arabian Peninsula, changed everything. With their ability to travel up to 25 miles a day and go over a week without water, they made long-distance trade possible. Each camel could carry hundreds of pounds. Salt, gold, cloth, or grain. Caravans ranged in size from a few dozen to several thousand animals. They moved slowly, often at night to avoid the heat, resting during the long, punishing days. It was not a glamorous life. It was one of dust, exhaustion, and monotony. Still, the trade grew. The economics of boredom, salt, and gold. At the heart of this vast system were two basic commodities: salt and gold. Salt was more than a seasoning. In a world without refrigeration, salt preserved food. It was essential for life, especially in the humid south, where people sweated constantly and needed to replenish minerals. Some of the richest deposits were found at Tagaza, and later at Taoudeni, mining towns in the heart of the desert where salt was cut into slabs and stacked like bricks. Gold, meanwhile, was mined far to the south, in the forests and river valleys of what is now Ghana and Mali. It was panned from rivers or dug from pits, and it was coveted everywhere, from West African marketplaces to the courts of Europe and Arabia. The exchange of salt for gold, pound for pound in some cases, might seem strange now, but in the economies of the time, the two were equally vital. Salt kept bodies alive. Gold kept economies moving. Caravans moved between these zones in slow loops. Northbound traders brought salt, cloth, copper, and beads. Southbound traders returned with gold, cola nuts, ivory, and even enslaved people. The journey could take months, and there was no guarantee of safety. Danger in every grain. The desert is indifferent to human life. Sandstorms can strip the skin. A mist oasis can mean death. Bandits lurk along some routes. Caravans sometimes vanish without a trace. To protect themselves, traders travel in large groups. They bring armed guards, experienced scouts, and careful inventories. Trade towns, like Takeda, Arawain, and Bilma, grow up around key stopping points. These towns are neither majestic nor large, but they are essential. They offer food, water, repair services, and most importantly, information. Who passed through last week? Were there attacks? Are the wells dry ahead? There is no central authority regulating these trades. There are no customs officials or standard currencies. Just trust, repetition, and centuries of practice. Many of the transactions happen by barter. Cloth is measured by the cubit. Salt slabs are carried on heads. Weights vary by region. Still, the system works because it has to. And beneath the surface of all this trade is another force. Religion, Islam, and the written word. By the 8th century, Islam begins to spread into West Africa through these very routes, not through conquest, but through commerce. Muslim merchants from North Africa and the Middle East bring with them more than goods. They bring books, languages, and literacy. Gradually, cities like Timbuktu become centers of Islamic learning. The Quran is copied by hand. Laws are written down. Contracts are drafted. The Arabic language becomes a tool of trade and governance. For many West African rulers, conversion to Islam is not purely spiritual. It is strategic. It ties them to the wider Muslim world, legitimizes their rule, and helps manage their growing empires. But religion never fully displaces local beliefs. Instead, it overlays them. Shrines to local spirits remain. Diviners still read cowrie shells. The two systems, spiritual and commercial, move together. And so, over the centuries, the Saharan trade routes knit together a continent, not with conquest or ideology, but with the boring but essential forces of supply and demand. Grain for cloth, salt for gold, labor for safety. No one person owns these routes. No one nation controls them. They are a web of trust, tied together by the movement of camel hooves and the scratch of scribes recording what has been sold. Still, you might wonder, what holds all of this together for so long? How can a system so vast and vulnerable persist for centuries? The empires that rose from dust. By the 11th century, the trade routes of the Sahara had done more than move goods. They had transformed regions, not quickly, and not with grand declarations. The change came in ledgers, market stalls, mosque courtyards, and caravan rest stops. But gradually, as the rhythms of trade pulsed through the desert's arteries, whole empires began to grow from the sand. These empires were not built on glory alone. They were built on management of people, goods, water, and time. The most well-known of these was the Empire of Ghana, not to be confused with the modern nation of the same name. Located in what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali, the Empire of Ghana thrived as early as the 8th century, controlling access to gold fields in the south, and acting as a gatekeeper for trade with North Africa. Ghana, the gatekeeper of gold. Ghana's power did not come from conquering distant lands. It came from sitting still in the right place. Salt caravans from the north passed through Ghanaian territory on their way to the forests of the south. Traders stopped at the capital, Kumbisale, where they paid tribute, exchanged goods, and sometimes stayed to do business for months at a time. Ghana's rulers, often described in Arabic sources as rich and powerful, used taxes to build their cities. They charged caravans for entry and for security. The state was run more like a ledger than a throne room. Traders could rest, trade, and continue, so long as they followed the rules. In return, they gained access to protection and predictable markets. And yet the empire was not timeless. By the 11th century, pressure from the Almoravids, Muslim reformers from the north, and shifts in trade routes began to weaken Ghana's control. The empire faded, replaced in time by another power, Mali, the empire of the middle. We've already glimpsed the Mali empire through the story of Mansa Musa, but from a trade perspective, its success was not just in Musa's journey, it was in Mali's geographic fortune. The empire sat between the forest goldfields and the desert salt mines, and it controlled key cities like Timbuktu, Djenné, and Gao. These were not capitals in the European sense. There was no marble, no colonnades, but they were organized, wealthy, and strategic. Each city had its own specialty. Timbuktu, for instance, grew into a center of Islamic scholarship and trade. It hosted scribes, teachers, and translators who wrote in Arabic, Songhai, and Tamashek. Djenné, situated on the Niger River, was a key hub for transshipment. Goods could move from boat to caravan and back again. Gao was older still, and it thrived on its connection to salt routes and river transport. What held these cities together was not just the empire's military power, but its ability to coordinate movement of goods, yes, but also of trust. Trade in the Sahara was slow. Months could pass between departure and arrival. Communication was limited to word of mouth or messages carried by caravan. In that world, a merchant needed confidence that their goods would be honored, that markets would be open, that taxes wouldn't change overnight. Mali provided that. The empire managed this not through centralized bureaucracy, but through layers of intermediaries, governors, market officials, and local chiefs, who all shared a stake in the system's stability. There were no printed contracts, but there were laws, and they were enforced. And at the heart of it all was salt. Taghaza, a city made of salt. Taghaza, located deep in the Sahara, was not a typical town. It was built almost entirely of salt slabs, homes, walls, even roofs, shimmering in the sun, crumbling with the wind. The salt mines at Taghaza were worked by enslaved laborers, often captured in the Sahel or taken as tribute. They dug long trenches by hand, using simple tools to carve out thick, crystalline blocks. These were then loaded onto camels, sometimes as many as 30,000 animals in a single caravan, and sent south. The town itself was a temporary place. Traders would stop briefly, gather their loads, and move on. There were no markets, no schools, only huts and the sound of chisels. Yet from this desolate place came the commodity that bound the region together. Salt was traded in marketplaces across West Africa. In Timbuktu, slabs were cut and sold like currency. In the savannah, it was shaved into food. In the forests, it was so rare that it was sometimes weighed like gold. But Taghaza was vulnerable. When conflict or climate disrupted the mines, trade routes shifted. One such shift came in the 16th century, when the center of salt mining moved further east to Taoudeni, another barren outpost, equally brutal, equally vital. Tuareg and Tamashek, the desert guides. None of this worked without the Tuareg. These semi-nomadic peoples, sometimes called the blue men of the desert for their indigo-dyed robes, acted as the guides, guards, and governors of the Saharan trade. Their knowledge of the desert was encyclopedic. They knew the stars, the winds, the location of every well and every danger. They were not part of a single empire. Instead, they maintained shifting allegiances, operating as local powers in places where central governments could not reach. They taxed caravans, offered protection, sometimes from themselves, and controlled key passes and oases. The Tuareg had their own language, Tamashek, and their own script, Tifinagh, an ancient alphabet, still used today. Their economy blended trade, herding, and tribute, and their influence could make or break a trade route. In a very real sense, they were the brokers of survival. Through their oral traditions, they passed down not just directions, but relationships. Which tribes to trust, which wells had gone dry, which towns had shifted leadership. In the desert, history is a living map. The architecture of trust. By now, it should be clear, the Saharan trade routes were not just economic corridors. They were social ecosystems. Trust was their currency. A trader might leave Sijil Masa and not arrive in Timbuktu for 3 months. He might never meet the buyer of his goods. Instead, he worked through brokers, middlemen, or family networks. Reputation mattered more than receipts. One broken deal could close a route, one betrayal could strand a caravan, and so, over centuries, the routes became self-regulating. They relied not on empires alone, but on shared expectations. You could trade salt for cloth, cloth for grain, grain for camels, and never write a tiai word of it down, but everyone knew their part. Still, these systems were not invincible. Climate change, shifting power centers, and the arrival of European ships along the coast began to challenge the overland routes, but not all at once, and not completely. Even as Atlantic trade grew in the 16th century, the old routes continued, leaner, perhaps, and more dangerous, but alive. So the question remains, what finally led to the slow fade of this network that once stitched together the sands? The slow fade and the legacy of the desert. The desert doesn't end, it merely continues beyond where the maps lose interest. But history, unlike geography, does have endings, though they are seldom sharp. They fray, slowly unraveling over time. By the 17th century, the great Saharan trade networks had already begun to fray, not in a sudden collapse, but in a quiet retreat. The caravans still moved, camels still plodded from oasis to oasis, markets still bustled in Timbuktu and Jenny. But something had changed. The world had grown wider. The ocean had arrived. The Atlantic shift for centuries. European ships had hugged the edges of West Africa's coastline. They had traded cautiously, spices, cloth, and beads in exchange for gold, ivory, and eventually enslaved people. But by the 1500s, their presence intensified. Portuguese, then Dutch, French, and English traders established fortified outposts along the coast. Suddenly, goods that had once traveled for months across the desert could reach the coast in days. Salt and cloth could arrive by ship. Gold could depart the continent without passing through Gao or Timbuktu. Even enslaved laborers, once transported north via Saharan routes, were now bound west, Across the Atlantic, the balance shifted, slowly at first, then more decisively. The great inland empires began to lose their economic advantage. Without control of the coastline, they could not tax the new routes. Without a steady flow of goods, their markets faltered. And without tribute from trade cities, their armies withered. But the decline of the Saharan trade routes was not just about competition, it was also about climate, conflict, and internal change. Climate and consequence. The Sahara has never been static, it breathes. With time, around the same centuries that European coastal trade was rising, the Sahel, the savanna belt just south of the desert, experienced increased aridity. Rivers shrank, pastures failed, wells dried, long-established routes became less reliable. Caravans had to travel further between water sources. Conflict erupted over control of what remained. Tuareg groups who once facilitated trade began to compete more fiercely over territory and tribute. The networks that had once cooperated began to fracture. In places like Tagaza, the salt mines faltered, laborers fled or died, new deposits were found elsewhere, but the long stable circuits were broken. A system based on predictability began to lose its rhythm, and in the cities, Timbuktu, Gao, Agadez, what had once been centers of wealth and scholarship, began to decline. Timbuktu's twilight. By the 17th century, Timbuktu was still known in Europe as a place of mythic wealth. Maps labeled it in elegant script. Explorers spoke of golden palaces and libraries the size of cathedrals. The truth was quieter. Timbuktu remained a place of learning, but its scholars worked under increasing strain. The Moroccan invasion in 1591 had shattered Mali's hold on the region. Armed forces from the north looted the city, seized its salt trade, and imposed foreign rule. Many of the city's finest minds fled. Manuscripts were hidden or destroyed. The schools still taught, but the patronage that had once funded them dried up. Trade continued, but as a shadow of its former scale. In time, the city shrank. Its great mud mosques, like Sankore and Jingareber, stood as monuments to a richer past. But the future was elsewhere now, along the coasts, in the ports, the persistence of the camel, and yet, even in decline, the desert remained alive. Caravans never disappeared entirely. In fact, some continued well into the 20th century. As late as the 1970s, salt was still being cut by hand in Taoudeni, loaded onto camel caravans and carried across the desert to Timbuktu. The journey took 2 weeks, sometimes more. Each camel carried several hundred pounds of salt. The guides followed the stars, the sand, the stories. Satellite images from the 21st century still show the caravan trails, faint lines carved into the earth by centuries of hooves. These paths are not just relics. They are the memory of movement. The Tuareg continue to live in the desert, though their role has changed. Many now blend traditional life with modern pressures. Tourism, conflict, migration. Their knowledge of the desert remains unmatched, and their oral histories preserve what books and archives have forgotten, the modern echoes. What then is the legacy of the Saharan trade routes? Not empires. Most of those are gone. Not cities, though some, like Timbuktu, endure in fragile form. The real legacy is systemic. How economies can form in the harshest conditions, how trust and repetition can replace paperwork, how geography can shape history, not with glory, but with grit. There are lessons in this boring history. Today we often think of commerce as digital, fast, borderless. But the Saharan trade was slow, manual, deeply local. It required humans to remember routes, prices, debts, customs. There were no apps, only memory and reputation, and somehow it worked for over 1,000 years. It tells us something about how networks form, not just through speed, but through persistence, not just through power, but through habit. And perhaps in a time when global supply chains can falter with a single storm, there is something to learn from the desert's way of moving goods, to trust the camel more than the cart, to value the guide more than the map, to see the system not as a miracle but as a pattern, repeated, revised, endured. The Sahara may no longer carry salt and gold as it once did, but beneath its sands are the footprints of a world that worked quietly, slowly, successfully. And yet even now, as the modern world hums with technology and urgency, a question lingers. In an age that moves so quickly, have we forgotten how to move wisely? Bricks, laws, and laundry, daily life in ancient Rome, the empire from the ground up. You are walking down a Roman street, not the Colosseum, not the Senate, not even the Forum, just a regular street, dusty, sun-warmed, uneven. On your left, a taberna, where a vendor slices cheese with a bronze knife. On your right, a brick wall covered in faded graffiti, political slogans, crude jokes, someone's name. This is where the real empire lives, not in marble or gold, but in the bricks beneath your feet and the everyday rhythm of Roman life. When people think of Rome, they imagine triumphs, legions, emperors, but that was only one layer of the city. Beneath it, quietly, perpetually, was another Rome, a Rome of shopkeepers and laundresses, engineers and bakers, enslaved porters and grain inspectors. A Rome that built itself every day, not with fanfare, but with effort. The bricklayers and the builders. Let's start with the most overlooked foundation, bricks. Rome was not built in a day, but it was built in astonishing quantity. By the time of Augustus, 27 BCE, 14 CE, the city had swelled beyond 1 million people. That required an enormous infrastructure of housing, insulae, or apartment blocks, as well as roads, sewers, baths, and warehouses. The Romans used concrete, yes, but even more than that, they used bricks, baked clay, mass-produced in kilns outside the city. These bricks bore stamps, inscribed with the name of the manufacturer, the estate, even the reigning emperor's initials. They were tracked, taxed, and standardized. Construction, for Rome, was a state-managed affair. Labor was often done by enslaved workers or poor citizens under contractors. A team might include bricklayers, lime mixers, scaffolders, and mule drivers. Buildings were not individual projects, but collective efforts, regulated by building codes to avoid fire, crowding, or collapse. Sometimes, entire neighborhoods were rebuilt after disasters like the Great Fire of 64 CE. And even then, the work continued. Systematic, unglamorous, essential. Running water in the aqueduct maze. If you had lived in Rome, the best part of the infrastructure would have been the water. The aqueducts, those great arches often shown in tourist photos, were just the most visible part. The real system was underground, a vast maze of conduits, tunnels, cisterns, and lead pipes. Rome had 11 aqueduct systems, delivering up to 300 million gallons of water per day. Water flowed downhill from springs, sometimes over 50 miles away. It filled public fountains, baths, latrines, and cisterns. Wealthy homes had private connections, but most people fetched water from communal fountains, some served by elaborate spouts shaped like lions or dolphins. The maintenance of these systems was handled by public officials, engineers, and enslaved laborers. Blockages, leaks, and theft were common problems. Lead pipes, contrary to popular myth, probably didn't poison the population en masse, but they did corrode and clog, requiring constant repair, and yet it worked. Quietly, day after day, Rome was a humming machine of hydraulic logic. The Forum of Laundry, Fuller's, and the urine tax, one of the stranger corners of Roman daily life, involves laundry. Specifically, the people who washed clothes for a living, known as fullones, fulling, was not done with soap. It involved a mix of clay, lye, water, and urine. Yes, urine, collected from public latrines or in jars on the street where passers-by could contribute. The ammonia in urine helped remove oils and dirt from woolen garments. Fullers would stomp the clothes in vats, rinse them, brush them with thistles, and lay them out to dry on frames. Some workshops handled dozens of tunics per day. The smell must have been incredible. The work was regulated. A Follonica, laundry workshop, had legal standards for cleanliness and pay, and the Emperor Vespasian even placed a tax on urine collected for laundry use. A fact so well known that pecunia non olet, money doesn't stink, became a common Roman saying. The fullers' guilds were well organized, with their own temples and trade secrets. Some became wealthy, others simply survived. Food, grain, and the annona. Feeding 1 million people required more than bakeries. It required logistics. The annona, or grain supply system, was a marvel of quiet administration. Grain was imported from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. It arrived by ship at Ostia, Rome's bustling port, and was stored in massive warehouses before being distributed to the population. By the early empire, eligible citizens could receive free or subsidized grain, a system known as the cura annoni. The distribution took place monthly with long lines and ration cards. It was a political tool as much as a welfare program. Any emperor who failed to deliver risked riots. Behind the scenes were thousands of people: dock workers, accountants, porters, and inspectors. They recorded weights, checked quality, and issued receipts. If the grain was spoiled or stolen, someone paid. Bakers converted grain into bread in public ovens. Others sold olive oil, wine, cheese, and dried fruits. Food stalls lined the streets offering lentils, garum, fish sauce, and flatbreads. There was no refrigeration. You ate what was in season or what was salted. Still, most people got by. Even the poor had access to calories, if not variety. The unseen empire. What tied all these systems together? Construction, water, laundry, food, was not heroism. It was administration. The Roman state functioned like a slow, massive spreadsheet. Taxes came in. Resources went out. Rules were posted in public spaces. Contracts were filed. Officials wrote letters, carved edicts, and enforced order. Much of it was dull. Intentionally so. Bureaucracy kept things predictable. In a city of 1 million, stability mattered more than brilliance, and yet this massive system only worked because people showed up. Laborers walked to job sites, cooks opened shops, carriers hauled bricks. Everyone contributed a part to a machine they didn't fully see, so the question lingers: what held the Roman Empire together longer, its legions or its laundries? Under the tiled roof, inside the Roman day. If you had lived in Rome, not as an emperor or a senator, but as a baker, soldier, freedman, or widow, your world would have started early. The Roman day began before sunrise, not out of discipline or custom, but because daylight was precious and candles were expensive. Let's step inside an insula, a Roman apartment building. These structures, often 3 to 5 stories tall, crowded together along narrow alleys and main streets. Built from brick and wood, they were not glamorous, but they housed most of Rome's urban population. The apartment life ground floors of insulae often held tabernae, shops or workshops, sometimes where the family lived in a room behind the counter. Upper stories held progressively cheaper and smaller units. If you were poor, you might rent a single room with no windows, no plumbing, and only a shared latrine downstairs. If you were better off, you might have a suite. 2 or 3 rooms, small but with a hearth and some privacy. The wealthiest Romans lived in domus, private homes with courtyards, painted walls, and floor mosaics. But these were rare, even in a city as large as Rome. The majority lived shoulder to shoulder above the din of the street, in buildings that were hot in summer, cold in winter, and vulnerable to fire. The kitchens, if there were any, were little more than hearths. Most people ate street food or took meals at thermopolia, the Roman equivalent of fast food counters. These shops served stew, lentils, meat scraps, bread, and cheap wine. For many Romans, this was the only reliable way to eat hot food. The work of the day. What did Romans do all day? Some jobs were loud and physical. Porters hauled amphorae of olive oil. Bakers stoked ovens and kneaded bread in vats the size of bathtubs. Masons mixed lime. Carpenters shaped beams. Many of these workers were enslaved, others were freedmen, former slaves who now labored for a wage or managed small businesses. Artisans formed guilds, collegia, that regulated their crafts and served as social clubs, religious communities, even funeral societies. A collegium might oversee the marble workers or the fire brigades. Membership offered protection, though not always prosperity. If you were literate, you might serve as a scribe or clerk, copying legal documents or transcribing correspondence. Some educated slaves became tutors for the children of the wealthy. Others worked as secretaries in household offices. Women, if free and unmarried, might run shops, manage laundry operations, or weave textiles. Married women were technically under the legal authority of their husbands or fathers, but in practice many participated in business, owning slaves, lending money, or managing property. The workday was long but interspersed with pauses. Lunch, gossip, errands to the bathhouse. Shops opened at dawn and often closed by mid-afternoon. The Romans believed in otium, leisure, as a necessary part of civilized life. The Roman bath, a ritual of the people. Few places reveal the routine of Roman life like the public baths. These were not just places to clean the body. They were centers of social life. Every Roman, regardless of wealth, could afford a bath. The smallest baths charged only a few quadrans, a fraction of a denarius. Larger thermae, like the baths of Caracalla or Trajan, offered sprawling facilities, gardens, libraries, snack vendors, and lecture halls. A typical visit involved a series of rooms: the apoditerium, changing room, tepidarium, warm room, caldarium, hot steam room, and frigidarium, cold plunge. There was sweat, oil, scraping tools, conversation. Bathers gossiped, discussed politics, debated poetry. Physicians even made rounds, offering advice to those with aches or fevers, heated by furnaces called hypocausts. The baths required enormous labor. Woodcutters, stokers, water carriers. The city's aqueducts fed these vast pools and slaves kept them scrubbed and orderly. But despite the engineering, the ritual remained human, a gathering of bodies in warm water, shaking off the city's dust. The gods of the house, even in the most ordinary homes, Roman life was thick with ritual. Each morning, families offered small prayers to the lares and penates, the household gods. Figurines stood in wall shrines, sometimes smoky with incense. These spirits protected the home and the food supply. Offerings included bread, wine, or bits of meat from meals. At crossroads and thresholds, Romans left offerings to Mercury or Janus. Every important act, marriage, contract, journey, required divine acknowledgement. The gods were not distant. They were present in ash heaps, doorposts, cooking pots. Superstition mingled with religion. Amulets against the evil eye. Lucky phalluses carved into sidewalks. Coins tossed into fountains. Names avoided. Omens heeded. Even emperors consulted. Augurs, priests who interpreted bird flights or sheep entrails before issuing decrees. The temples of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus towered above the city. But the real spiritual life happened in kitchens, courtyards, and alleyways. The sounds of the night. As twilight fell, the streets began to darken. Roman cities had few street lights. Oil lamps were expensive. Fires were feared. Most people hurried home before full darkness. The law banned chariots and carts from the streets during daytime. So night became the hour of deliveries. You might hear wheels rattling over stones, voices arguing in Greek, dogs barking. Somewhere, someone singing off-key. Night was a time of tension. Without police, people hired bodyguards or stayed indoors. Insula windows glowed briefly with lamplight, then darkness. The city hushed, save for the occasional shout from a drunk or the slosh of a wine jug against stone. And in that darkness, another Rome unfolded, one not recorded in scrolls or speeches, but felt in fatigue and footfall. So many lives, quiet and unheralded, overlapping like roof tiles. From the potter to the washerwoman, from the teacher to the tanner, they carried the empire not with swords but with steady hands. The famous Rome, the one of generals and orators, rested each night on their labor. But one question remains: how did these ordinary Romans, so busy, so burdened, understand their own place in this colossal machine of marble and rules? Ashes and echoes, the end of the Roman day. You wake up in the same room as yesterday, a cot against a crumbling plaster wall, the smell of yesterday's bread, and voices in the alley below. Outside, Rome stretches on, smoke curling from bakeries, crows circling the forum, the endless clatter of wheels against cobblestones. But what happened when it all stopped? Not just for one person, but for the thousands who sustained the city. When their bodies aged, their trades declined, or the tides of empire shifted. In this final section, we explore the fading hours of a Roman life, not as a tragedy, but as a quiet continuation of systems. Because even death in ancient Rome was a matter of paperwork, pavement, and public procedure. The business of burial death in Rome was not just an ending, it was an event, and it had rules. By law, no one could be buried within the city walls, so the roads leading into Rome were lined with tombs, some grand, some humble. Mausoleums of marble sat beside stacked columbaria, underground vaults for cremation urns, roadside graves, and communal burial pits for the poor. Wealthy families prepared for death meticulously. A good Roman citizen would have a will on file, often updated with notaries. Wills named heirs, freed enslaved persons, and allocated property, sometimes down to the last lampstand. For the majority, funerals were managed by funerary societies, collegia of tradespeople who pooled money to bury each other. For a small monthly fee, members were guaranteed a proper cremation or inhumation, a funeral procession, and a marked grave. These societies offered what the state rarely did: dignity and death for the working class. The procession itself could be grand or minimal. Musicians played flutes, hired mourners wailed. The deceased was displayed on a bier, often in their best toga. Eulogies were delivered, and in the wealthiest funerals, wax death masks of ancestors were worn by actors in procession, literal faces of the past walking among the living. Yet even in mourning, the routines prevailed. Paperwork was filed, priests cleansed the home, the body was burned or buried, and the city resumed its rhythm. The tombs speak. Walk along the Via Appia, and you'll find yourself in a conversation with the dead. Inscriptions etched in Latin, carefully lettered, still legible centuries later. To Gaius Julius Hilarius, freedman of Gaius Baker, honest in trade, faithful to his wife, Claudia. To Livia Drusa, who wove wool with care. To my mother, who taught me my letters and never cursed in anger. These were not the proclamations of generals. They were quiet memorials, testaments to bread baked, hours worked, debts paid, meals shared. In a society where most people left no written records, tombstones became biographies. Some left warnings. Stranger, go on. I was like you. You will be like me. Some left jokes. I did nothing wrong. I only took a little wine. Even in death, the Roman citizen remained part of the system. Named, registered, remembered, however briefly. The fragile inheritance. What happened to a Roman's life after death depended on more than family. It depended on paperwork, memory, and property. Women could inherit land. Slaves could be freed by will. Children could receive allowances if they met conditions, like marrying by a certain age or taking a specific career. But most inheritance was fragile. If no heirs were named, property might revert to the state. Sometimes, a freed slave would inherit and manage an estate on behalf of a deceased master's children. Other times, claims were disputed, and court cases dragged on for years. And for those with nothing to leave, there were only stories. A neighbor might remember how Marcus, the porter, always smiled. A child might light incense for a grandmother buried in a shared tomb. The legacy was personal, not financial. As the centuries passed, these personal memories became fainter until they were replaced by archaeological records, fragments of tile, and graffiti scrawled in stairwells. The decline from below, it's tempting to look for the fall of Rome in big moments, barbarian invasions, assassinations, plague, but much of the empire unraveled at the level of the daily. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the systems that had once hummed smoothly began to fray. Grain shipments faltered, coinage was debased, trade slowed, fewer bricks were stamped, water mains collapsed, public services once funded by state taxes increasingly fell to private citizens. Wealthy elites were expected to pay for roads, aqueducts, festivals. When they declined or fled the cities, the infrastructure declined too. Bathhouses closed, fountains dried, the fullers left, streets cracked, people adapted. New religions rose, like Christianity, offering hope and community outside traditional Roman structures. Guilds became churches, shrines became chapels, Latin remained. But the rhythm of Rome began to shift, and yet, life persisted. Families cooked, children played, bread was baked. Even in decline, the machine ticked forward, if more slowly, more locally, and with different gods watching. The immortal details. What remains of these ordinary lives? Not their names. Most have vanished. Not their deeds. Most were never written down, but their patterns endure. You can still walk along streets laid by Roman surveyors, drink from aqueducts repurposed by modern cities, read contracts based on Roman legal forms. Our calendars, plumbing, road systems, and legal terminology owe them a quiet debt. More than anything, the Romans showed how vast civilizations don't depend on heroes alone. They depend on people who show up, who sweep the floors, wash the tunics, fill the ledgers, repair the arches, pass laws about plumbing, pray to house gods, die in rented rooms. They built an empire by doing what needed to be done repeatedly, quietly, and that perhaps is the most boring and profound truth of all. So we ask, if our cities fell, who would remember the hands that held them up? One brick, one receipt, one bowl of lentils at a time. End of story 3. Bricks, laws, and laundry. Daily life in ancient Rome. The paper path. Life in the Imperial Chinese civil service. A childhood to county exams. Becoming a man of letters. You are born in a small farming village in Ming Dynasty, China. The year is 1437. Your family, like most in your region, tills the soil and keeps chickens. Life is measured by the rhythm of the seasons. The rice must be planted before the rains, harvested before the storms. Firewood must be gathered before the cold arrives. There's little time for rest and even less for dreaming. But your father has a hope, not for himself. His hands are already thick with calluses. But for you, he teaches you the characters scratched into bamboo strips. He says them aloud. Slowly, you repeat them. Your family has saved a few coins to send you to the village school. The classroom is simple. Packed earth floor, rough wooden benches, and a teacher who lives just above subsistence. Yet inside this humble room is a world far larger than any field outside. You begin with the 3-character classic, a primer for children, then the book of songs, the Analects of Confucius, and the classic of filial piety. The words are poetic but distant, ancient even by your teacher's standards. Still, you memorize them, because this is the path, the only path. You are not alone. Boys from nearby families, some sons of peasants, some sons of minor clerks, also come to the schoolhouse. You rise before dawn and stay until your eyes blur. The brush is your tool, the inkstone your plow. Your back may not bend from lifting grain sacks, but it stiffens from hours hunched over parchment. You are being prepared not for war, not for commerce, but for the county examination, the first of 3 great trials in the imperial keiju, or civil service exam system, a national obsession in imperial China. To become a government official, the Shai, was the single greatest aspiration for a man outside of the nobility. The system had existed in some form for centuries but became more formalized under the Sui and Tang dynasties and truly entrenched during the Song, Ming, and Qing. It was not designed to reward power nor privilege, but rather learning and moral rectitude. In theory, the state needed officials to run its vast bureaucracy, from the imperial court in Beijing down to the local magistrates in small towns. Someone had to count the taxes, resolve land disputes, and ensure that granaries did not rot from within. This immense paper machine needed literate men, trained in ritual, law, and Confucian doctrine. Thus, the exams, they were open to all free men, though in practice wealth gave you time to study, and lineage often meant better teachers. Even so, stories of poor scholars rising to greatness were told again and again. 1 in 10,000 might make it all the way, but in villages like yours, even that distant hope was worth the sacrifice. The county-level exam, Shukai, you are now 16. The exam is held in a nearby city. Your father walks with you for the first few miles. He does not speak much. You carry a pack with your brush, inkstone, rice cakes, and bedding. You are nervous. The Zyukai, or Cultivated Talent Exam, is the first hurdle. It is administered by the local prefect. You enter the compound through high wooden gates and are assigned a small examination cell. It is no larger than a cupboard. A stone slab serves as your writing desk by day, your bed by night. You will be locked in for up to 3 days, depending on the dynasty and local custom. There is a hole in the corner of the floor for bodily needs. Meals are passed through AIR slot. You are not allowed to speak, and every scrap of paper is inspected before you begin. The prompt arrives. It requires you to write in the Wen, or 8-legged essay format. This structure is rigid, prescribed: opening, amplification, preliminary, exposition, initial argument, central argument, latter argument, final argument, and conclusion. Each segment must be carefully constructed, not too ornate, not too plain. You write slowly, stopping often to think, then write again. The ink smudges slightly in the heat. The candle flickers. You do not sleep much, but you do not notice. When it is over, you return home and wait. Weeks pass. One day a clerk arrives on horseback. He posts the names of those who passed on the city wall. Your name is there. Your father weeps. You are now a Shukai, a certified scholar. You may now wear special robes, avoid corporal punishment, and are eligible for exemption from certain taxes. You can open a private school, tutor others, and you have officially stepped onto the bureaucratic ladder. But this is only the beginning. The scholar's new life. As a Zyukai, your life changes slightly. You are not yet rich nor powerful, but you are now marked by potential. Matchmakers take interest. Neighbors differ slightly in conversation, but prestige does not pay for shoes. Most Zyukai continue to study, sometimes for years, preparing for the next examination, the provincial exam. Some will never pass it. They will teach instead, or serve as assistants to officials, or retreat into quiet poverty. Still, your days are now structured around the classics and commentaries. You read not just Confucius, but Mencius. You learn about rights and music, governance, and loyalty, rectification of names, and the mandate of heaven. This is no longer about reciting lines. You must now interpret. What is the proper action for a magistrate faced with an unjust landlord? How should an official balance duty to the emperor with the needs of the people? These questions are abstract, yet in a few years you may be asked to write policy proposals on them under pressure, with your career on the line. So you prepare quietly, dutifully. Your hands, once clumsy with brush strokes, now glide with rhythm. Your essays are clean, your logic firm. You begin to think less like a student and more like a judge. You consider words carefully. You speak less, write more. Still, you know, failure waits behind every paper wall. Each year, thousands take the provincial exam. Only a few hundred pass. The system is slow, and it forgets no one. Men in their 40s compete against boys half their age. The exam rooms are sealed and anonymous. Cheating is punished with death. Copying another's essay is a life-ending crime, yet you persist because there is no other path. You are too far now to turn back, and not yet far enough to rest. You rise early, you study late, you live on steamed buns and tea. The world of family and neighbors recedes. Your eyes grow weak, your thoughts narrow. You no longer write to express yourself. You write to survive the next round. Still, some days you wonder, is this the path to virtue or just another hunger dressed in ink and silk? The bureaucrat's burden, service, corruption, and the quiet collapse. You have passed all the imperial exams. You wear the robes of a jinshi, and for a brief moment, people see you not as a man, but as a symbol. Parents urge their sons to follow your example. Poets write couplets about your achievement. Local officials send small gifts, lanterns, bolts of cloth, peaches carved with calligraphy. But as the celebration fades, the paperwork begins. You are summoned to the Ministry of Personnel. Here your rank is recorded, your exam performance, family background, and region of origin are all entered into vast ledgers. Then you are assigned your first post. It is not glamorous. It is not close to home. You are made magistrate of a remote county in the mountains of Sichuan. The real work begins. Your job is all-encompassing. The magistrate is known as the parent official, Fumu Guan, the father and mother of the people. You are judge, tax collector, registrar, and emergency coordinator. You manage famine relief, oversee irrigation repairs, and maintain public order. Each morning begins with petitions and reports. Farmers come to settle land disputes. Widows plead for inheritance rights. A monk accuses a landlord of stealing temple land. You listen, you deliberate, you write. Always you write. The paperwork is endless. For every decision you make, a memorial must be sent up the chain. For every case you hear, a record must be kept in the prescribed format. You submit monthly reports on the weather, grain prices, births, deaths, crimes, taxes collected, and funds spent. You are not trusted. You must prove constantly that you are honest. Sometimes your decisions bring peace. A long feud over water rights ends with a handshake. A corrupt village head is dismissed, and the villagers thank you. For a moment you believe in the system, but other times you are helpless. The empire's fragility. In your second year, the rice crop fails. Locusts have eaten the green shoots. The villagers are desperate. You open the granaries, releasing emergency stores, but it is not enough. You request more from the provincial governor. Weeks pass. Nothing comes. When the first deaths are reported, you stop writing and begin begging. You send desperate dispatches by courier, knowing they will sit in stacks on someone else's desk. The funds arrive months too late. The granaries are empty. The people are gone. You walk through abandoned fields wondering if the classics ever prepared you for this. You think of Confucius and his emphasis on benevolent rule. You think of Mencius and his belief that a ruler who neglects the people loses the mandate of heaven. You look at your ink-stained hands. You wonder what good they did. Still you continue. That is your duty. Colleagues, bribes, and silent codes. You rise in the bureaucracy. You attend more banquets. These are not for pleasure. They are informal arenas of negotiation. Wine flows. Faces smile, and under the surface, messages are exchanged. A superior hints that a small gift would smooth the approval of your next project. A merchant suggests that a contract might be adjusted in return for a donation to the local school, of which you are, conveniently, the overseer. The language is coded, the gestures are subtle, but the implication is clear. Corruption is not an exception. It is the oil that keeps the gears turning. You resist at first, but over time you realize that a small bribe to a courier means your report reaches the capital in a week, not a month. A favor done now brings a favor returned later. You tell yourself it is pragmatic, that it helps the people, that you remain clean where it matters. But inside something shifts. Transfer and promotion. After 6 years, you are promoted to a post in the provincial capital. You are no longer on the front lines. You review other magistrates' reports, draft policy memos, and sometimes help select new candidates for the service. Here, you see the system from above. You see how favoritism shapes appointments, how well-written but empty reports are praised, while honest but poorly phrased ones are ignored. You see that an official with no connections will wait decades for a promotion. And you see how even the most talented can be undone by a single political misstep. Still, you persist. You marry the daughter of another official. Your son is born. You teach him to recite the Analects at age 5. You begin preparing him for the same exams you once took, even as you privately question their worth. Years pass. Your hair grays, your posture bends, but your calligraphy remains elegant, and your reports continue to please the right people. You are made an advisor in the Ministry of Revenue in the capital. Whispers of collapse. In the capital, you see signs of decline. The palace is magnificent, but behind the red walls the emperor is increasingly isolated. Eunuchs dominate access, ministers jockey for position, memorials pile up unread. Some decisions are delayed for months. When they come, they are vague and full of contradiction. You attend court sessions that feel like theater. Officials quote the classics with perfect cadence, but none speak the truth. When a river floods in the south, the official report blames excessive rain. You know it was because of mismanaged dikes and siphoned funds, but the man who wrote the report is promoted, not punished. You walk home in silence. One day a rebellion breaks out in a distant province. Another follows the next year. Bandits form armies. Tax revenues fall. Silver shipments slow. The couriers you once bribed now flee their posts. Entire counties are no longer under imperial control. You draft a memo. It is never answered. You begin to understand that the bureaucracy, so vast, so detailed, is not invincible. It can fail not through war or invasion, but by erosion, quiet neglect, the slow loss of meaning behind every form, every seal, every rote phrase. The final years, you retire at 62. Your last post was ceremonial. You no longer tried to reform anything. You issued routine statements. You wore your robes. You nodded at meetings. You watched younger men make the same compromises you once did. At home, you read the classics again, not for exams, but for comfort. You remember your village, the cramped exam cells, the hunger, and the hope. You think of the people you tried to help, the ones you failed, the rules you bent, the rules that bent you. You watch your son prepare for his own exams, hunched over the desk as you once were. He asks about the 8-legged essay. You correct his structure. You say nothing about the world beyond the page. You wonder, was the system a path to virtue, or a maze that led nowhere? The cod that changed the world, a maritime empire of fish, salt, wind, and scales, the hidden wealth of the North Atlantic. You stand on the creaking deck of a small English vessel, somewhere in the chill waters of the North Atlantic. The sea is gray, The sky is grayer. The cold air tastes of salt, damp wood, and distant ice. Your hands are cracked from the cold and chafed from the rope. This is not a story about war. There are no banners or sieges, no palaces, no thrones. This is a story about fish. Specifically, Gadus morua, Atlantic cod, thick-bodied, slow-moving, and plentiful beyond imagination. Cod once filled the waters off the coasts of Newfoundland and Iceland in such dense numbers that sailors claimed they could lower baskets and bring them up full without hooks. Whether true or not, the myth reveals a reality. These cold northern waters once held one of the richest and most overlooked food sources in human history, and in the 15th and 16th centuries, as Europe strained against the limits of its land, climate, and diets, cod became more than a food. It became an empire, the ocean's larder. To understand why cod mattered, you must first understand medieval appetites. In much of Catholic Europe, the church calendar restricted meat consumption on nearly half the days of the year. Fish, especially cheap, storable fish, was essential, but inland regions had few reliable sources of it. Rivers were overfished. Transport was slow. Most people lived far from the coast. Then came salted cod. When properly gutted, brined, and dried, cod could last for months, sometimes even years. It was lightweight, compact, and rich in protein. Unlike oily fish like herring, cod dried hard, allowing it to survive long voyages without spoilage. The process was simple, if labor-intensive. The fish were split, laid over wooden racks called flakes, and sun-dried in the stiff coastal air. The resulting slabs were nearly white, flat as planks, and tough as old leather. But boiled or stewed, with enough butter or onions, it was food. More importantly, it was year-round, shippable, and profitable. From Bristol to the Banks, by the early 1400s, English, Basque, Breton, and Portuguese fishermen were venturing farther into the North Atlantic. At first, they hugged the coasts of Ireland and Iceland. Then came whispers of new fishing grounds, vast shallows where the cod practically leapt into the boats. These were the Grand Banks, off the coast of what we now call Newfoundland. The English, especially fishermen from Bristol, were among the first to exploit them regularly. Records are sparse, but by the mid-1400s, Bristol ships were quietly sailing west, not for conquest, but for cod. They rarely spoke of it. Fishing grounds were guarded secrets. No maps marked the best spots. Captains taught routes only to trusted sons or crew. This was not colonization. It was seasonal migration. Hundreds of ships crossing the Atlantic each spring to fish the banks, dry their catch on shore, and return in autumn with holds full of stiff white slabs. Europe barely noticed. But by 1500, cod had become one of the most important economic commodities in the North Atlantic. Basques and Barrels, one group in particular, mastered the trade. The Basques, a seafaring people from what is now northern Spain and southwestern France. The Basques were experts at salting fish, preserving cod without drying it, an advantage in foggy or rainy climates. Their technique allowed faster processing and better storage. Their barrels filled with salted cod became prized in Spanish, French, and Italian markets. More importantly, Basque ships may have reached the coasts of North America decades before Columbus's first voyage. They left no settlements, no flags, just drying racks, smokehouses, and seasonal camps. Quiet industry on cold shores. Unlike other explorers, they came not to find spices or gold, but to harvest an endless protein supply. Salt, wood, and trade routes. Cod was valuable, but cod alone was not enough. To process it, ships needed salt. Often this came from Biscay or Brittany, where salt pans harvested crystalline flakes from sun-evaporated seawater. Salt barrels were packed onto ships before departure, destined for use months later on the Newfoundland coast. Then there was wood, for fires, for drying racks, for barrels. Many crews built temporary camps to process the fish, often trading with local indigenous peoples for supplies or simply helping themselves to timber. These small interactions would later bloom into colonial entanglements, but in the early days, it was mostly extraction, seasonal and silent. You can imagine a harbor in Devon or La Rochelle, busy with the smells of tar, rope, and fish. Barrels rolled down gangplanks. Men shouted over crates. Cod was not glamorous, but it paid. More importantly, it fed. The growing towns of Europe needed protein, and the dried cod of the Atlantic was suddenly a staple in Catholic diets from Lisbon to Krakow. It reached the Caribbean, Brazil, West Africa. It was fed to enslaved people on plantations, traded for sugar, and used to provision long voyages. Cod quietly connected the world. The cod fueled expansion as cod fishing became more systematic. European powers began to stake firmer claims on the coasts of North America. The English established Newfoundland outposts. The French moved into Acadia. The Portuguese favored southern banks closer to the Azores route. None of these early settlements were large. Most were seasonal, but they served a purpose: to protect access to cod. Governments began issuing monopolies, fishing charters, and naval escorts. Conflicts erupted over drying sites, anchorage rights, and access to harbors. A fish that had once swum unnoticed in the sea had become the subject of diplomacy, cartography, and even skirmishes. Back in Europe, cities that processed, consumed, and exported cod boomed. Bergen in Norway, Bristol in England, Bordeaux in France. Cod was traded for wine, salt, linen, even books. It became currency, commodity, and calorie. And yet, even now, cod remained in the background of history, not glorious, not dramatic, just boring, useful, and utterly transformative. Quiet conquerors. The cod trade did not build palaces, it did not crown kings, but it laid the foundation for European maritime expansion. It trained sailors, perfected ship designs, and funded the infrastructure needed for colonization. Long before Jamestown or Quebec were founded, fishermen had crossed the Atlantic hundreds of times, building quiet familiarity with wind patterns, seasonal shifts, and survival on strange shores. Cod taught Europeans how to live from the sea. It linked Newfoundland's foggy rocks to the vineyards of Portugal, the salt flats of France, and the bustling harbors of London. It sustained sailors, soldiers, laborers, and enslaved people. It fed revolutions and built fortunes slowly, quietly, plank by salted plank, and yet, in a ledger, it was just a number. In a pantry, just a slab of fish. No one erected monuments to the cod, but perhaps they should have. For what other creature has shaped the course of human history so profoundly, yet been remembered so little? You stare out over the gray Atlantic, nets coiled at your feet, and wonder what happens when the fish disappear. Empire by the barrel, cod in the age of colonization. The smell of dried fish hangs heavy in the harbor, not just in one port, but many. Bergen, Bristol, Bordeaux, Lisbon, even inland towns, far from the salt spray of the Atlantic, carry traces of it now. Cartloads of cod pass through their gates, stiff, white, and pungent. By the early 1600s, Atlantic cod had become more than a commodity. It was infrastructure, a linchpin in the emerging Atlantic economy. And while no cannon was fired in its name, cod helped fund the very navies that carried conquest across the seas. In a strange way, this fish, lowly, mundane, and monotonous, helped shape the next phase of global history, the era of colonization. But this wasn't always part of a grand imperial plan. Often, it was accidental, driven by supply chains and seasonal need. By the movement of barrels and hands, it was boring, and that's why it worked so well. From seasonal shacks to settled shores at first, cod fishing was temporary and cyclical. European crews crossed the Atlantic in spring, fished for months, dried or salted the catch, and returned in autumn. They built makeshift shelters to process fish, low wood huts for drying, shallow pits for salting. But these temporary stations began to grow more permanent. If a crew could leave behind racks, sheds, and tools, their next season would start faster. A few men might stay through the winter, guarding equipment, then a few brought families. So began the slow creep from camp to colony. In Newfoundland, St. John's evolved from a summer station into a small settlement, anchored by its excellent harbor. The French followed suit in Plaisance. Placentia, the English claimed Cupids, founded in 1610. These were not bustling towns, but clusters of drying platforms and fish cellars, dotted with huts of rough timber. In these cold outposts, life was hard. Winters were long. Supplies ran low, but the sea was generous, at least for now. And Europe had a hunger. Cod, sugar, and slavery. By the mid-1600s, the cod trade merged with a far more brutal enterprise, the Atlantic slave economy. Here's how it worked. Ships from Europe carried goods, textiles, metal tools, alcohol to West Africa. There they were exchanged for enslaved people. Those captives were transported to the Caribbean and Americas. The Middle Passage. Once in the New World, they were sold into plantation labor, producing sugar, molasses, tobacco, and other high-value crops. But what would feed them? Sugar was for profit, not nourishment, and shipping meat from Europe was expensive. The solution? Dried cod. Cheap, durable, protein-rich cod from Newfoundland and New England was perfect for feeding enslaved workers on Caribbean plantations. It became part of a triangle trade, quietly lubricating the gears of empire. Slave ships carried human cargo south. Merchant ships carried codfish back north. From the harbors of Boston to the slave ports of Barbados, cod was currency. Its pale, leathery slabs traded for molasses, rum, and misery, and yet it remained invisible in most histories, because it was never the point, just fuel for a machine. Cod and the colonial North. In North America, the cod trade became a lifeline for New England. Early settlers in Massachusetts, lacking the gold or silver of Spain's empire, found their wealth not in the soil, but the sea. From towns like Gloucester, Marblehead, and Newburyport, fishermen took to the cold Atlantic, casting lines for cod. Massachusetts merchants exported dried fish to Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa. It paid for lumber, tools, books, even slaves. Cod became colonial capital. The economy of New England hinged on three things: cod for export, timber for ships, trade with the West Indies. Every fish salted and packed in a barrel could be turned into West Indian sugar, which could be sold in Europe, which could fund more ships, more fishing, more trade. And so, while southern colonies in Virginia thrived on tobacco, the northern coast grew on cod, but not without tension. Cod wars and commercial rivalries. The fish-rich waters of the North Atlantic were not limitless, and as demand grew, so too did conflict. The English, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and later New Englanders all vied for the best grounds and harbors. Disputes flared over drying rights, anchorage access, and territorial claims. France laid firm control over parts of Newfoundland, protecting its French shore. Britain retaliated with naval patrols and laws favoring English merchants. Skirmishes occurred, not full battles, but seizures of ships, destruction of drying racks, and local clashes. One might call these the first cod wars. Quiet, low-grade conflicts fought with fishing lines and ledgers, not muskets. But they mattered. By the 18th century, cod had become a national interest. British naval policy began to protect fishing fleets. Insurance markets in London grew around fish cargoes. Cod was now part of a global web of commerce, law, and empire. A commodity, yes, but also a strategic resource. Changing taste, changing power back in Europe. The fish shaped diets, especially in Catholic countries. In Portugal, Spain, and Italy, salted cod became a staple, known as bacalhau. It was consumed in stews, fritters, and simple boiled dishes. Entire cookbooks were written on how to prepare it in dozens of ways, because it was eaten year-round, especially during Lent. A poor man's food in one place became a delicacy in another. It crossed social classes, feeding both peasants and priests. At the same time, merchants amassed quiet fortunes. Unlike spices or gold, cod brought slow, steady wealth. Ships launched, fish packed, profits made. No single voyage made a man rich, but a decade of good catches could build an estate. Thus, the fishmongers, barrel makers, and shipping agents of the North Atlantic carved out a quiet prosperity far from royal courts. It was commerce by habit, by tide, by calendar, and it worked. An industry of silence. Still, cod remained curiously invisible in the grand narratives of empire. It appeared in ledgers, not letters, in invoices, not proclamations. It funded trade, trained sailors, and fed soldiers, but was rarely honored in speech or stone. That's partly why it succeeded. Cod didn't need attention. It needed processing, packing, transport. It was boring, predictable, profitable. By the early 1700s, Britain's fishing fleets numbered in the hundreds. Newfoundland exported millions of dried cod annually. New England's cod fueled plantation economies abroad. French traders worked seasonal posts along the Canadian coast. Cod had become the white gold of the Atlantic, and still, it swam in quiet. Shoals unaware, but perhaps it could not last. The barrels kept moving, the racks kept drying. The ships kept sailing, and the world grew more dependent. What happens to an empire built on fish when the ocean begins to thin? Collapse in the cold. The vanishing shoals of the Atlantic. By the end of the 19th century, cod was no longer just an Atlantic trade good. It was an institution. Generations had lived and died harvesting, drying, and trading the white-fleshed fish that, despite its simplicity, helped build settlements, support slavery, and fuel commerce. And yet, beneath that quiet dependability lay the seeds of collapse, because no one imagined a world without cod. For 4 centuries, the North Atlantic had seemed to offer endless bounty. Fishermen believed with genuine certainty that the sea was inexhaustible. If a shoal disappeared from one bank, it would return next season. If cod moved deeper, bigger boats would follow. This wasn't arrogance so much as inherited confidence. What Some called the myth of plenty, but by the 20th century the signs of strain were no longer subtle. Something was happening in the deep. The cod were vanishing. Steam, steel, and trawlers. For most of the cod trade's long history, fishing had been done by hand. Sailboats launched dories into the banks and men hauled in fish with baited lines, one cod at a time. Slow, exhausting, dangerous work. But in the 1800s, the rules changed. Steam power revolutionized the industry. Steam trawlers could drag heavy nets across the ocean floor, pulling in thousands of fish in a single sweep. By the early 20th century, these vessels were larger, faster, and more efficient than anything before. And they didn't just fish the Grand Banks near Newfoundland, they stripped them. Trawlers scraped the seabed, catching not only cod but everything else: haddock, flounder, and even the slow-growing coral forests that had supported oceanic life for centuries. Barrels were replaced with industrial freezers. Cod wasn't salted on racks anymore. It was flash-frozen at sea, shipped across oceans, and consumed as fresh fillets in restaurants. Efficiency soared, so did profits, but the fish were fewer. Warning signs and ignored data as early as the 1950s. Marine biologists began sounding the alarm. Surveys showed fewer juvenile cod in key breeding grounds, spawning biomass. The overall reproductive stock was shrinking. The average size of landed cod was decreasing. Some scientists warned of fishing down the food web. Others called for quotas, but the warnings were easy to ignore. The fish still arrived in port. Catches still fed markets, and besides, regulation was politically unpopular. In Britain, Canada, and Norway, the fishing industry was an employer of thousands, a national symbol and a point of pride. Cod wasn't just food, it was identity, and yet, year after year, the numbers quietly dropped. Between 1960 and 1990, global cod stocks declined by over 70%. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It was administrative, debated in committees, delayed by policy reviews, and buried in spreadsheets. Until the silence came. The Great Collapse. Newfoundland, 1992. The most famous collapse came in 1992. In Newfoundland, where cod had once swarmed in such numbers that nets tore under their weight. That year, after decades of overfishing and false optimism, the Canadian government declared a full moratorium on cod fishing. Over 30,000 people lost their jobs overnight. Entire communities along the coast dependent on fishing for centuries fell into economic ruin. It was and still is one of the largest industrial closures in Canadian history. Boats sat idle in harbors, nets dried on fences, fish plants shuttered their doors. Generations of knowledge how to gut dry salt packs suddenly became obsolete. The cod were gone, not extinct, but reduced to a tiny fraction of their former abundance, and they didn't come back. Not in 5 years, not in 10. The ocean, once so generous, had stopped providing, and the Atlantic cod, once the engine of empire, became a cautionary tale. What was lost? The collapse wasn't just economic, it was cultural. Fishing communities in Newfoundland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and northern Scotland weren't just job markets. They were living records of songs, dialects, tools, and rituals passed from one net to the next. When cod vanished, so did much of that heritage. The drying racks fell into disrepair. The knowledge of salting and curing faded. Recipes lost their ingredients. Even the vocabulary changed. Young people no longer spoke the sea's language. The cod collapse stripped away more than livelihoods. It erased memory, and it wasn't confined to the North Atlantic. Around the world, industrial fisheries began to face similar crises. Tuna in the Pacific, anchovies off Peru, sardines in California. Everywhere the story echoed. What we thought was infinite wasn't the cod today, so where is the cod now? Still in the sea, but less so. Some stocks have shown signs of recovery, especially where strict protections were enforced. Norway, for instance, implemented rigorous quotas and monitoring systems. Iceland introduced a science-based management plan. Their cod fisheries, while reduced, remained viable, but the Grand Banks, once the richest fishing grounds on Earth, have not recovered fully. The ecosystem itself has changed. With cod gone, shrimp and crab populations surged, changing food chains and market patterns. In a twist of fate, many fishermen now catch shellfish, species that once hid from cod. The fish that built empires is now uncertain, a subject of research, regulation, and nostalgia. In grocery stores, cod still appears on labels, but often it's imported from Norway or Iceland, flash frozen in China, sold in England or Canada. The humble slab on your plate may have traveled farther than any medieval sailor ever did, and yet most who eat it today have no idea that this fish once shaped the course of empires. Reflections from the Racken. The end. The story of cod is a story of scale. How something small and boring, plain white fish dried on wood racks, could feed continents, spark colonies, fund slavery, and collapse economies. It reminds us how history is shaped not just by kings and battles, but by barrels, boats, and biology. Cod didn't conquer the world, but it fed those who did. It built ships, bankrolled expeditions, and kept enslaved labor alive. It allowed Europe to stretch across oceans, and then slowly it vanished beneath the waves and out of memory. Perhaps somewhere in the deep a shoal still gathers, silent, slow, unaware of its former fame. And perhaps the lesson lingers too. When we build civilizations on what we believe is infinite, we often find we are wrong.